Hey guys, so I just wanted to make a practice video for Unit 3 for you. So what I'm going to do is I have 4 FRQs here that are based on Unit 3 topics. Just explain different parts of them, why is this the answer, stuff like that. There are a few questions in here that are related to later units, so I'll briefly go over those. And as you go through the material for next unit and the unit after, you will see that. Okay, the purpose behind this is for you to get some practice, and then also for me to explain, well, this is why this is the answer, and help you. So what I would recommend, okay, is look at the different FRQs. If you're looking for practice, do the FRQ, watch the video, look at it, pause it, do it, hit play, see how you did, and go on from there. Okay, so let's get started. All right, so the first one here is FRQ number 3 from the 2010 Form B test. All right, so this one's pretty straightforward. Okay, we're going to start with an easier one. All right, so you have 4 different things, and it says basically, what's going to happen to GDP and price level Y. Okay, so let's look at A. All right, an increase in the price of crude oil, an important natural resource. Okay, so if you increase the price of crude oil, okay, it says it's a resource. So you're going to break that down and you're going to look at it and say, okay, it's the price of a resource. Is that an aggregate demand shifter or is that an aggregate supply shifter? And the answer would be it's an aggregate supply shifter. So what it's going to do, GDP is going to go down, price level is going to go up, because this increase is going to cause the short run aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. Okay, a helpful hint for this, if you can visualize it, draw out a quick graph. Okay, look at it, draw out a quick graph, shift your curve and see, okay, my GDP went down, my price level went up. Okay, the second one, a technological change that increases the productivity of labor. Key here, productivity of labor. Is that an aggregate demand shifter or is that an aggregate supply shifter? Okay, the correct answer would be that it's an aggregate supply shifter. So again, we're going to have a shift in the short run aggregate supply. Our GDP is going to go up. Our price level is going to go down because our aggregate supply has shifted to the right. Our aggregate supply has increased. Again, if you can't visualize that, if you can't realize, okay, curve shifts to the right, and then all of that happens, just draw out a quick graph. Okay. Third one, an increase by spending by consumers. That one's pretty straightforward. Consumer spending goes up. That's the first shifter of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand goes up. Okay, when aggregate demand goes up, we get a rise in both GDP and price level. Okay, that one should be pretty straightforward. All right, the next one, D, we've talked about a little bit in this unit. That's more of a Unit 5 thing. So it says depreciation of the country's currency in the foreign market. So what does that mean? So you have to break this down to figure it out. Depreciation means the value goes down. If the value of your country's currency goes down, more countries are going to obtain that currency to buy it because your goods are relatively cheaper. So what that means, your country's currency goes down, more countries get your currency and more countries buy your products. That means you're going to export more, which means your net exports will go up. Remember, net exports is a shifter of aggregate demand. So GDP will go up and price level will go up because aggregate demand is going to go up. Okay, again, the depreciation is more what we're going to learn in Unit 5, but hopefully that makes sense to you. Okay, so look at these 4. Hopefully these explanations make sense to you, and see how you did. All right, next I have FRQ 2014, number 1. Okay, so this is a longer FRQ, just like number 1 always is. And as you can see, there's a couple different topics that they hit here. Most of this FRQ is based on Unit 3. There is one part, D down here, or D and E, that are based on Unit 4, but I'm going to go over them anyway to kind of help do this whole question. Okay, so let's break this down piece by piece. So first thing it says, assume that the United States is currently operating below full employment. Okay, if we are below full employment, that means we are in a recession. We are in a recessionary gap, or what is also known as a negative output gap. Okay, real GDP with a balanced budget. That doesn't really mean much for right now. So the first thing it asks you to do, draw a correctly labeled graph of the aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, and then show each of the following: current output, price level, full employment. Okay, so what you should do is you should draw a graph that looks like this. Okay, pretty simple. Label your axes, price level, or just PL, real GDP, or you can put GDPR. Okay, now you draw your long run aggregate supply. Okay, LRAS here. Right under your long run aggregate supply is where full employment is. Okay, always, always, always. Now, in order to, I know I skipped to part 2, but in order to make sure you draw your graph correctly, okay, I usually draw my long run aggregate supply first and then say, okay, I need to be below full employment, which means I need to be to the left of my long run aggregate supply curve where the two curves intersect. Okay, so I draw my aggregate demand, label it AD, draw my aggregate supply, label it SRAS. Okay, where they intersect needs to be to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve. Why? Because we are operating below full employment, so we are in a recessionary gap. Where they intersect, PL1, like it tells me, Y1, like it tells me. Again, you can, if it doesn't tell you what to label it, you can label it PL1, you can label it PLE, Y1, or YE, but this specifically says Y1 and PL1. Please make sure you label it what they tell you to do. Okay, so hopefully, starting off, you're able to draw that graph. That's super important for the macro exam to be able to draw this graph, whether it's recession, equilibrium, inflationary gap. This is one of the most important, if not the most important graphs for macroeconomics. Let's move on to part B. The United States government increases spending on goods and services by $100 billion, which is financed by borrowing. How will the increase in government spending affect each of the following? Unemployment, cyclical unemployment, and the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, right now, 100 billion, where the amount of money and the borrowing is not super important right now. We just need to think, okay, they are increasing their spending. Okay, they are trying to push us out of this recessionary gap back to equilibrium. They're trying to increase aggregate demand. So what is going to happen to these two? So first off, cyclical unemployment is going to go down. That should be pretty straightforward. Cyclical unemployment, if you remember, is the type of unemployment that you have when you are in a recession. Okay, so if we go out of a recession, if they push us out of our recession, our cyclical unemployment is going to be the type of unemployment that is gotten rid of. Okay, people are going to get their jobs back. People that were laid off are going to get their jobs back or get a new job. Next up would be the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, nothing is going to happen to the natural rate of unemployment. Again, the long run aggregate supply curve is always on top of the natural rate of unemployment. Our long run aggregate supply curve is not shifting. Our natural rate of unemployment is going to stay at 5%. The only way that the natural rate of unemployment is going to change is if something causes our long run aggregate supply curve to shift. We don't have that right now. Okay, we don't have growth. We don't have a huge shrinking of our economy as a whole. So our natural rate of unemployment is going to stay the same. All right, and then next up is part C. If the marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.75, calculate the maximum possible change in real gross domestic product that could result from the $100 billion increase in government spending. What this means is calculate what would happen if the multiplier were to go into effect, okay? Hopefully you remember the money multiplier. So the answer is 400 billion. How did I get that? The formula for the money multiplier is 1 divided by the MPS. Well, it doesn't tell me what the MPS is here, but it tells you the MPC. How do you find the MPS? The MPS is 1 minus the MPC. So 1 minus 0.75 is 0.25. When I do that, I get 4. I multiply 4 times 100 billion, and the maximum change is 400 billion. Moving right along. Okay. Part D and a little bit of part E are unit 4. Okay, because they're part of the question, I'm going to explain them. So if you haven't looked at unit 4 yet, kind of just bear with me here, look at it, and maybe go back and look at this video again after you've learned some of the unit 4 stuff. So it says, using a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market, show the effect of the $100 billion increase in government spending on the real interest rate. Really quick, the loanable funds market is the market for money that people are borrowing. Businesses, individuals, the government borrows money. Anybody that borrows money, other countries, all four entities can borrow money. And the loanable funds market is the graph for borrowing money. So looking at what happened, the government is spending $100 billion. It told us in the last question, they're financing it by borrowing. So they're borrowing $100 billion to spend. Okay. The loanable funds graph, again, if you haven't looked at Unit 4, is a supply and demand graph for loanable funds. It's a supply and demand graph for borrowing money. On this question, and generally on questions like this, they'll accept either one of these graphs. They're the same graph, just a different shift, okay? You have real interest rate on the y-axis. You have quantity on the x-axis, okay? So you can either shift the demand, which would make sense, right? The government is demanding more money to borrow. That one is the most common answer they'll get, but they have also announced that, or also accept that they will accept a shift in supply. Why? Because they can see kids arguing, all right, you know, instead of demand going up, they borrow a lot of money, so there's less available to borrow. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, they'll accept either one of these. Bottom line, the same thing happens to the real interest rate, which it asks show the effect of the, or it says based on the real interest rate change, which you're going to need for E. Both times it goes up. Again, why is real interest rate on the y-axis? Because interest is the price of money. All right, so let's look at E. Based on the real interest rate change in Part D, what is the effect on the long run economic growth rate? So real interest has gone up. The answer to this question is the growth rate is going to fall. Why? Think about what we have learned in this unit. What is the only way for there to be long-term growth, long-run growth? That is a shift to the right of your long-run aggregate supply curve. The only way for that to happen is for there to be an increase in investment spending, which increases aggregate demand and increases aggregate supply. How do businesses spend money? Yes, businesses have money, but businesses mostly spend money by borrowing. A lot of people don't realize that. Okay, they see these giant corporations that have a ton of money. They don't dig into their pocket. They borrow money to continue expanding. Well, if the price of money is higher, they can't or won't borrow as much. So therefore, there's going to be less economic growth at this moment. All right, and then the last one, F. Now assume that instead of financing the $100 billion increase in government spending by borrowing, the United States government increases taxes by $100 billion. With this equal increase in government spending and taxes, will the real gross domestic product increase, decrease, or stay the same? Explain. The answer is that real GDP will still increase. Why? Because if you look at lesson 3.4 for this unit, the money multiplier is always one higher than the tax multiplier. The money multiplier is more effective than the tax multiplier. So going back to C, if the money multiplier is 4 and a $100 billion increase in spending is going to bring up the GDP by $400 billion, the tax multiplier is 3, which means that the $100 billion increase in taxes will bring down the GDP by $300 billion. So you have a net gain of $100 billion. Okay, hopefully this FRQ made sense to you. We're going to continue, see how you did. We're going to continue looking at 2 more. Okay, these next 2 are similar to the last one. Okay, again, they're number 1. So number 1, you know, are longer FRQs. Okay, this is from 2011, Form B. All right, so let's look at this one. Assume that the economy of Meekland is in a long-run equilibrium with a balanced government budget. Using a correctly labeled graph of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, show each of the following. Long-run aggregate supply, the output level labeled YE, and the price level labeled PLE. Notice, different than the last one. This one says YE and PLE instead of Y1 and PL1. You have to label it like they tell you to. Okay, so first thing you do, draw your graph. Okay, so right now, you would ignore this second line right here. You'd ignore the second AD, the PL1, Y1. You should have your axes labeled PL, GDPR. You should have your long run aggregate supply curve, LRAS. YE, you could label this YF underneath it, but they want it YE here because they said so, because we're currently at equilibrium. So we are currently at our natural rate of unemployment. And PLE have our SRAS, okay, AD, they're on the long run aggregate supply curve because we are currently in long run equilibrium. Okay, that is part A right there, ignoring this second line. Now, assume consumer confidence falls. Show on your graph in part A the short run impact that this has. Consumer confidence falls, meaning consumers are worried about a recession. That's what that means. Consumers are worried that the economy is going to go downward soon. So if you are worried that the economy is going to go downward, what do? You stop spending as much. You save your money. Maybe you're worried that you might lose your job. So you stop spending as much, consumer spending falls. That's the first shifter of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is going to go down, as shown here. So now we are in a recession. We get a new point, PL1 and Y1. Okay, so your graph after A and B should look like this. All right, now C, we have to draw a second graph. Using a correctly labeled graph of the short run and long run Phillips curves, show the effect of a fall in consumer confidence on inflation. So, long run Phillips curve, vertical, okay? Short run Phillips curve, downward sloping, okay? It tells us, label the initial long run equilibrium point A and the new short run equilibrium point B. So, our initial point, we were at equilibrium. That means we are at where the two curves intersect on our Phillips curve. Remember, these graphs are not drawn on top of each other, but they are tied together. So when one thing happens on here, something happens on here. All right, so now we are going to look at this and see what happens to the graph. If you remember, if there's a change in aggregate demand, that causes a slide along the short run Phillips curve in the opposite direction. So short run Phillips curve review. Aggregate demand curve shifts, you slide the opposite way. So we shifted to the left, we slide to the right. If this had shifted to the right, we would have slid to the left. If the aggregate supply curve shifted, you get a new curve opposite direction. So let's say the aggregate supply curve had increased. Your short run Phillips curve would shift to the left. Let's say your short run aggregate supply curve shifted to the left, your short run Phillips curve would shift to the right. We had a aggregate demand shift to the left, which means we're going to have a short run Phillips curve slide to the right. Okay, hopefully you understand that. All right, rest of the question. D, if the government and the central bank do not pursue any discretionary policy change, how does the fall in consumer confidence affect government transfer payments in Neekland? Explain. Okay, this is a review term here we learned way back in September. Transfer payments are money collected from the government. The answer is they're going to go up. Why? Transfer payments includes unemployment. So the government, central bank, we haven't talked about the central bank yet. That's next unit. Okay, that's monetary policy. Nobody's jumping in to help the economy. So the economy's in a recession. Transfer payments go up. Why? More people collect unemployment. Simple as that. Government benefits. You could write unemployment. It doesn't have to be word for word the answer here. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Same as last question. It's also asked for the loanable funds. They like tying as many graphs together in macro as they can. Okay, so E is the same as the last question, okay, where the government is borrowing money to pay unemployment. I know that sounds a little weird, but they're lending out all this unemployment money. It is actually similar to what's happening now with the stimulus plan. They're borrowing some money to send the stimulus checks out to people. So they're borrowing money for unemployment. again, what happens? Demand for loanable funds goes up, okay, or supply goes down. Why? Because the government's demanding more. This would be the most common graph. This is what I would recommend you draw. This is what most kids are going to draw, but they will also accept if you shift the supply because there's less money available. Think of this. This would be from the government perspective. This is from businesses or other people saying, okay, there's less money available, so that's why we're paying a higher interest rate. Okay. And then last question, in the absence of any changes in fiscal and monetary policies, in the long run, will the short run aggregate supply curve shift to the left, shift to the right, or remain unchanged as a result of the fall in consumer confidence? Explain. It is going to shift to the right. Why? So we are in a recession. Okay, aggregate demand has shifted to the left. We're in a recession. The government doesn't jump in to try to shift aggregate demand back to the right. So what happens? Short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. We go back to equilibrium. Okay. Why does it shift to the right? Wages, other input costs fall. You can give either of those explanations. Wages themselves may not fall. Generally, they're not going to cut your hourly pay, but wages as a whole will fall because instead of you're a business, instead of hiring 10 workers during the recession, you have to lay a few people off. So now you're hiring 7. So you're paying less. So wages fall in general. Hopefully this question made sense. See how you did. Okay, let's move on to the next one. All right, last question here is from 2017. Again, it's number 1. Okay, we're not going to do the whole question, though. We're just going to do parts. All right, so assume that the economy of country X has an actual unemployment rate of 7%, a natural rate of unemployment of 5%, and an inflation rate of 3%. All right, let's break that down. Actual unemployment rate 7, natural is 5, meaning our unemployment rate is higher than our natural. Right away, blinking light, we're in a recession. Using the numerical values, draw a correctly labeled graph of the short run and long run Phillips curves. Label the current short run equilibrium as point B. Also, you have to use the numerical values. That they don't always do. That's something they're starting to do, more recently. All right, so here's our first graph. Long run Phillips curve, short run Phillips curve. We are in a recession, okay? A recession would mean we are to the right of our long run Phillips curve. Our unemployment rate is higher than our natural. With numbers, it makes more sense because 7, obviously is greater than 5. That's why we are here. Okay, plot your numbers. There you go. Now, assume the government of country X takes no policy action to reduce unemployment. In the long run, will each of the following shift to the right, shift to the left, or remain the same? Okay, short run aggregate supply curve, explain. The short run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right in the long run because nominal wages will fall in response to high unemployment. This is similar to the last question, okay? We are in a recession. We are assuming that the recession is caused by aggregate demand having shifted to the left. If there's no policy action, meaning the government doesn't step in and start spending to try to increase aggregate demand and shift it to the right, how does the economy self-correct? Well, if the aggregate demand curve has shifted to the left, the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right and we go back to equilibrium. And then it says explain why wages fall because there's high unemployment. So you're paying less people. What about the long run Phillips curve? No change. This long run Phillips curve does not move. The long run Phillips curve is always on top of our natural rate of unemployment. The long run Phillips curve can move if our natural rate of unemployment changes. How does the natural rate of unemployment change? If we have economic growth, our natural rate of unemployment might go down. Let's say we have a huge growth in our economy in terms of our capital. There's tons of jobs. And instead of going back and settling at equilibrium, we have a new equilibrium where our natural rate of unemployment is 3%. The long run Phillips curve would move somewhere over here. That's not the case here. Here we're off equilibrium, we're going back to equilibrium. All right, and the last parts for this question are C and D. Identify a fiscal policy action that could be used to reduce the unemployment rate in the short run. C here is a very easy question. It's asking, do you know what fiscal policy is? And do you know contractionary versus expansionary? So we're in recession. We need expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, what are the tools of fiscal policy? The tools of fiscal policy are taxes and government spending. We're going to either spend more or we're going to decrease taxes. We need to increase aggregate demand. We're going to spend more and directly increase it, or we're going to cut taxes and hope that consumers spend more money. Pretty simple. And the last part here, draw a correctly labeled graph of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. Notice it doesn't say long-run aggregate supply, so I just need these two curves. Show the impact on the equilibrium price level and real gross domestic product of the fiscal policy action you identified in Part C. So I draw a short-run aggregate supply curve, draw an aggregate demand curve. I label my axes, PL, GDPR. Label my equilibrium, PL1, Y1. Now, I said we're going to increase spending or decrease taxes. Both of them will do the same thing. Both of them will increase aggregate demand. How do I show an increase in aggregate demand? I shift aggregate demand to the right. I get a higher price level, PL2, but I get a higher GDP, Y2. Hopefully this made sense. Okay, see how you did on this question. Hopefully this video helped you. Okay, helped you understand, why are these the answers, stuff like that. Hopefully you use this for practice.